I think we're going to go ahead and get started, and hopefully Representative Mayfield and Senator Stoops will join us later. Welcome to the second in a series of legislative updates. We are happy to sponsor, as the Chamber of Commerce, the Bloomington Chamber of Commerce, along with the League of Women Voters of Bloomington and Monroe County. And here comes Peggy Mayfield. Welcome. I'm going to be moderating this session. I'm Mary Morgan. I'm Director of Advocacy and Public Policy for the Greater Bloomington Chamber of Commerce. And again, welcome. This morning, our local legislators will report on their work and priorities for the current session of the Indiana General Assembly. They'll each have up to 10 minutes. After that, we will welcome questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please limit your question to 1 minute. Our timers are in the front row here, and they'll show the remaining time for each question. You should have received a yellow sheet when you came in, looks like this, as well as a white sheet. The yellow sheet has instructions and allows space for you to formulate your questions so that you can be sure and fit in what you need to ask in the 1 minute time frame. If a questioner has more than one question, we'd ask that you not ask a question until everybody else has had a chance to go first. And if there's time remaining, we will allow one more question per person. The white sheet lists government leadership and legislators from Monroe County. And the back side of that sheet gives tips for contacting these officials. This morning is intended as an information session and an opportunity to get information from our legislators. It's not really intended as a time to make public statements or to engage in debate, so we'd ask you to respect that, please. And we'd also ask for you to frame your questions to elicit information for the benefit of all of us and enable any of the legislators to weigh in. You may disagree or agree with the legislators' comments, but we ask you to be respectful for them. And we also ask you to hold your applause until the end of the session today, and please silence your electronic devices. This morning we have with us, and we're very grateful for their attendance, Representative Jeff Ellington, of the 62nd District, Representative Peggy Mayfield for District 60, and Representative Matt Pierce from District 61. Let's start with you, Representative Ellington.
Thank you for having us today, and thank the League for putting these events on to get really knowledge and information out to the public. I'm Jeff Ellington. I represent District 62, which includes parts of the counties of Monroe, Martin, Davies, and Greene, a very rural area to a really high-density area, so there's a lot of differences amongst my constituents. So what I'll do today is just read about the 6-week mark on what we've been able to accomplish so far, and we'll give a little synopsis, I will, on each of those bills and where they're at and what they could do if they pass out the way the House passed them. So we'll start and we'll talk about how many bills we've had and a percentage of those votes. So the House continues its strong bipartisan tradition under Republican leadership with all 115 bills passing the House with bipartisan support. And 103 out of the 115 bills receive less than 10 no votes. So, for example, the Senate Enrolled Act with House Bill 1001, I Learn, Hold Harmless. It passed the House 90-0. It was signed by the governor, and it ensures that both teachers and schools will not be negatively impacted by poor student test scores resulting from the new I Learn assessment by enacting a 2-year Hold Harmless bill. And might I add that when we passed a bill that made those changes a session ago, that I was only one of a few that stood up and said, you know, when we change testing procedures, and no matter what department it is in the state, that we really need to allow extra time. And I proposed back then a 2-year hold harmless, and so now we see where we're at. Also, 1002 out of the House dealt with teachers' evaluations, and Representative Cook, which was a educational position, it passed the House 100-0, and it was heard and it is held in the Senate Education. And what that bill would do was remove the requirements in the statute that student test scores must be significantly inform a teacher's evaluation, making it clear in state law that local districts will from now on have the complete autonomy over how student exams are used when evaluating teachers, and no longer will be at the state mandated level. We passed House Bill 1003, education deregulation. It passed out of the House 98-0, and it's referred to the Senate. And what that bill does, it bolsters flexibility and autonomy of schools by allowing schools to petition the State Board of Education to waive specific existing requirements for schools while protecting vital regulations over topics such as health, safety, physical oversight, collective bargaining, and accountability. It also repeals the requirement for teachers to obtain 15 hours of workforce-related PGP points for licensure. It also encourages innovation by allowing schools to substitute STEM courses for Core 40 courses. Also, House Bill 1004, it stops surprise billing. Representative Smaltz was the author of that. It passed out of the House 99-0, and it's also referred to the Senate. And what that does, it protects Hoosiers from surprise medical bills by preventing health care providers from billing patients for out-of-network services if they were provided at an in-network facility. So it kind of lets you know what you're going to be ended up with in the end. Senate bill and also Senate Bill 5, which is combined now with House Bill 1005, is a health care transparency. It was heard and held in the House Public Health, and some concepts from HB 1005 will be incorporated into Senate Bill 5, others into House Bill 1004, and also Senate Bill 243. And the concepts for these bills combined requires health care providers and insurers to provide good faith estimates for the cost of non-emergency procedures and how much of out-of-pocket cost the patient is expected to pay. Also requires hospitals and ambulatory surgical centers to public prices for procedures publicly. Initiates the creation of an all-payer claims database which will help identify cost savings, and it requires the outpatient facilities to provide information that will ensure appropriate billing. And I'll try to make sure I don't go too long. There's several other initiatives here, but as you can tell, most, if not all of these bills, and a great percentage-wise, went out with bipartisan support. But we're still working to try to keep that those initiatives from the House side in the Senate bills that's coming across. So I appreciate you being here. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Ellington. Senator Mark Stoops, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Please share your thoughts.
Thank you. It's the past week has been a slow week as the bills cross over. I think Representative Ellington did a good job of talking about some that I think are all very important, and those are the transparency bills for hospitals and for the pharmacy benefits managers, which are both hopefully going to work their way through the House and get bipartisan support. Indiana has some of the highest hospital charges, some of the highest drug charges in the country, if you can believe it here, and that's just because there are plenty of loopholes that allow these charges to happen, or the pharmacy benefit managers to adjust their pricing and also what drugs are administered just based on how much they can make off of it, right, rather than what you actually need. So hopefully we'll see those bills continue to move forward. The week before the last week, we finished up our Senate bills. You know, what happens is typically the controversial bills are saved to last, and I agree there are a lot of bills that go through with unanimous support or near unanimous support by both parties. That's a good thing. There's definitely some things that need to be worked on in the state legislature and in the code. But these are bills like, for instance, there was a school shooting in Noblesville. So the child that was able to get a hold of their parent's weapon and bring it to school, and he tried to shoot a girl, and a teacher jumped in the way. The teacher was also shot. Very tragic situation. But now there's a move to say that anybody who is 12 or older can be tried as an adult. Right? So before that was 13 in Indiana, already very low. And even though this is a terrible thing that happened, This is a child of 12 that, if this bill goes through in the future, would be able to be tried as an adult, go to an adult court. And I think everybody agree, every specialist, everybody that deals with children, that this is way too young. The only thing that's going to happen is you're going to get that kid out of jail when they're in their mid-20s, and they are going to be a hardened criminal. I mean, there's no other way around it. So the best thing is if they go through a system of services that can be provided to children and teens. And again, that was passed, and that was more of a statement bill saying, well, we're going to be tough on crime, or we're actually going to do something about this situation, rather than passing a bill that says we need to make sure that people who have their guns in their house with children, that children can have access to, need to have their guns locked. So that was a Senate bill I had that we could not amend into that language to make sure, well, fine, if you're trying to make schools safer on one side, how about let's deal with the base cause of the issue rather than the symptoms. So that brings me to another bill, arming teachers. So the Senate passed a bill allowing, so they passed a bill last year that said schools could arm teachers. But in that bill, and we argued about it, that there was no provision that the teachers had to be trained. It was just that the teachers could carry guns. So obviously a bad idea. That bill was passed. There are 4 school corporations that have armed teachers in their schools. This year, at least there was a proposal to say, okay, well, that was maybe not such the best idea in the world, having more guns in schools with teachers who aren't trained. So let's implement some training requirements. So that's all, that's good. Most people who deal with the situation, including law enforcement officers, don't want teachers to have guns in schools. But this bill provides that there's 40 hours of training for a teacher, and 5 or 6 of it might be in handling the weapon, recognizing false weapons, recognizing signs. Some of these are really good things that all teachers should know, but a very limited amount of actual weapons training. And then I was able to get an amendment in that said, well, they have to have additional training every year, because this was just one block of training, and then I guess they were just going to be let go. So now there's additional training every year, but a law enforcement officer who actually has a weapon and uses a weapon, they need 840 hours of training, right? So we're sticking these teachers in there who might have some sense of false security, thinking they've had this minimal training. They get in a situation with an active shooter, and that that kid who's in there with those weapons, that kid doesn't plan on coming back out. If there's a shootout, I think that's even more what they would want. Again, it's a very tragic situation. Again, I tried to amend the bill that would say we have to have safe storage of weapons, if kids can get access to them. But that was not allowed to go through. But arming the teachers with training did pass. Some other issues of concern about that are, what happens if this teacher who has a weapon in school, now what if somebody gets that weapon from the teacher and causes harm? What happens if that teacher accidentally shoots another student, right? And then who's liable? Because I think any attorney will tell you that if there's an injury or death in school, they're going to sue everybody. They're not just going to sue the school board who made the decision. They're going to sue the teacher. And who's going to back that teacher up? I guarantee you that when it comes to millions and millions of dollars in settlements, that teacher's not going to have anybody at their back, even though they're the ones that wanted to do the right thing, wanted to be able to protect the kids in their schools. So a lot of questions about that. Again, another fairly controversial abortion bill. Maybe Representative Mayfield can talk more about this one, because I think it's kind of over to her. But Last year, I think, or maybe 2 years ago, there was a provision that if you had a chemical abortion like a pill or a miscarriage, even a miscarriage, you had to dispose of the remains, like bury the remains. You had to report it. So in this situation, if you had and then I think the state spent about $1 million trying to defend that. Court said no, it's obviously not constitutional. So there was clarifying language, but still in the bill that came out of the Senate, if a woman has a chemical abortion, so when you think about the stage of development of that, I won't call it a fetus because it's not even technically, scientifically a fetus at that point, actually is discharged, they're supposed to collect it. The woman is supposed to collect it in a vial and take it back to either the person that provided the drugs or somebody to bury it, right? And I think there was some language in there that it made it optional, but they still have to go through the process of being told this is, you're gonna be asked to bring this aborted fetus back and dispose of it. So again, it's just an attempt to limit abortion rights or embarrass women who decide to have an abortion. Let's see, on some good points, I was actually able to get a bill passed that would ask for a summer study committee to come up with a system whereby companies who are trying to be carbon neutral can invest in Indiana forest. So they can basically write a check, and which is used by the Benjamin Harrison Trust Fund that would go to land trusts or the DNR to actually purchase forest land for preservation. And then I've been trying for years to get, thank you, I've been trying to get for years to get more money into the Benjamin Harrison Trust Fund and the Bicentennial Trust that's used by land trust to purchase land for preservation, but I could not get that in the budget. So this is a way where you get corporations that come to Indiana and they want that ability. Their goal is carbon neutral, so they want to offset the carbon they produce, but they need a mechanism to do that. And in Indiana, say Toyota wants to be carbon neutral. They have a huge fund to attempt to be carbon neutral. In this case, Purdue would come up with a mechanism to say, okay, this forest has this amount of carbon value, and then they could use that in their recording to justify their reduction in carbon. And on the other hand, there's what's called carbon farming. So thank you, my time's up. But basically, Natural Resources and Department of Ag are very interested in this because they're trying to do programs to encourage farmers to practice methods that actually put carbon back into the soil. So not only does it store the carbon, it actually makes the soil better. Plenty of other things to talk about, so I'll answer questions later, but thank you.
Thank you, Senator Stoops. Representative Mayfield.
Thank you, Mary. One thing we had to remember that this is a short session, and it's really intended to only fix very, very important things. It's not really intended to take on new policy discussions because we don't have enough time to really thoroughly vet them. In the second half, today's the 15th, and the committee hearing deadline the committee reports is the 27th. So we only have 2 weeks to hear all the Senate bills that are coming over, which even my last count, the House passed like 120-something bills, and the Senate passed like 169 bills. Half the people and even more bills are coming over to the House. So you're going to see a lot of attrition in the bills that are coming over because we're only going to have 1 or 2 committee hearings to be able to hear them. And doing it in a rushed manner does not generally make for very good policy if you don't have enough time to discuss it. Representative Ellington hit several of the high points, as well as Senator Stoops. A couple of other things. It's very hard to keep track of these. I know that the Senate has already heard a couple of the House agenda bills, like the capital projects and the mobility of licensing. Any license that's managed by the professional licensing agency. We're trying to make it more flexible so that as people move in and out of Indiana, they don't have to go through a lot of hurdles to find their jobs here. Because a lot of times a spouse will not take a job if their other spouse has to go through a lot of hurdles to maintain their license in a new state. So we're trying to make it more of a, if there's substantially similar requirements in their previous home state, that they can just transfer that with minimal problems. The other thing that was an agenda bill that really I hadn't even thought about much until it was brought up is means testing for the kids who are trying to get their career technical training and they're doing internships and so forth, and this is what we want. We're encouraging that, but it was affecting their eligibility for social services like TANF and SNAP. Because if they were getting paid for their internships when they were in high school, it might disqualify their entire family for benefits. So we are removing the internship pay from the means testing so that the whole family will continue to benefit while this youngster is hopefully going to go on to not ever need public assistance. And one of the other things that got added to that was the census workers. That's a really good paying temporary job. A lot of people are available to do that, but they don't want to do it if it is going to affect the permanency of their assistance. And so we are going to, if it gets through the Senate, we're going to exclude that as well. So they have an opportunity for a few months to make a nice little nest egg to help them out. A couple of bills that, you said it really was coming off at a slow start. I feel like we've gone out of the gate from the very beginning. We had hearings last week. I have three hearings scheduled for next week for bills that have gone over to the Senate. So it's still pretty fast-paced. I still have language in 4 of my bills moving. The State Board of Nursing was amended into Representative Smaltz's bill because the advanced practice nurses ran out of time, so he said, put it in mind, same subject, and he's carrying the bill, and it's moving along. I have one very brief efficiency bill, and then we still have I won't say controversial, but the one that's getting the most attention of mine is the firefighting foam containing PFAS, because that is not a known carcinogen, but a suspected carcinogen, and it's an additive that goes into firefighting foam for fuel fires and chemical fires, and it smothers it, a lot like halon would do in a confined space, but this is out in the open. But if it gets into the environment, it doesn't break down very fast at all, like hardly ever. It's eternity. And if it gets into the water systems and the soils, there could be some real issues with humans, but they're still doing the studies. So since it is still the most effective way to put out those types of fires, there really isn't a second best option. We're going to control when they can use it unless it's an emergency. You have a real fire, go ahead and use it, but you can't train with it unless you can contain it, treat it, and dispose of it safely. And so but then it opened the whole gate of PFAS and other things. So you can't avoid PFAS. There's hundreds of different combinations. It's in your waterproof clothing, your microwave popcorn bags, your soil-resistant carpet, your paint that is washable. If you wear clothes, eat, or breathe, you're probably coming in contact with PFAS. So the EPA is just now starting those studies to see what's the level of toxicity that a human should have over a lifetime, because it's cumulative. What's the level of safety? I also had some language to protect volunteer firefighters if they should get hurt in the line of duty. And a bill that was sent to me from the Senate, I had to ask to make sure I understood this, and it actually affects very few people, but in a state health plan, if a woman has a mastectomy, right now everything covers reconstruction, but it doesn't necessarily cover custom prostheses if they choose not to have reconstruction. And this bill would require that, because some women don't want to go through the reconstruction, but they, for balance, appearance, or just, fitting into their clothes, that this would require the state's plan to cover. But you're talking about how many women work for the state, who will get breast cancer, who will have a mastectomy, who will opt for prostheses over reconstruction. So it's actually much cheaper than the reconstruction, but it wasn't in code, so they weren't authorized to do it. And then, okay, I want to touch on, since Senator Stoops brought it up, on the abortion bill. And it is not an abortion bill. I will not be carrying that bill, but it will be coming to the Public Policy Committee, I believe. When 1337 passed, and that's the one that said you had to do the disposal of fetal remains, the State Department of Health indicated that the situation of a woman who eventually aborts at home or has a miscarriage at home, they could come up with their own rules for the disposal. Right before session started, they came back and said, no, that's not under our purview, so we need legislation, and that's why the bill was introduced. What's happening is, and it's never, ever, ever a requirement. What is happening is women will go home and they'll go through the process. Now, they've been warned what's going to happen, but until you've experienced it, it might be much more than what they expected. And when it happens at home, they're facing a choice of the trash can or the toilet, and some of them just don't want to do that, but they don't know what else to do. This does give them the option of putting it in a container and taking it back, if they want to, for incineration, or cremation, or interment. There is no requirement. It's really for the benefit of the mother, her conscience, whatever, to dispose of that. There's never a requirement. I guess. I think that's about all I have to cover for now. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. Representative Pierce.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So first off, two of the bills that got a lot of attention in the beginning of the session have already been signed into the law in the last couple of weeks by the governor, so that you remember the $291 million. The decision was made by the Republican leadership that they would use that to pay cash for university buildings that were already approved for bonding in the budget. We had offered the alternative to use that for teacher pay. And if you don't like teacher pay, there are other kind of human needs that could be met with that money, and we weren't able to prevail on those. So I think it's pretty clear at this point, if it wasn't already, that the teacher pay issue will not be addressed in this session, and we'll have to see what happens next year. The other thing is the other bill, Senate Bill 2, which dealt with the hold harmless, because we changed up the iLearn. Went to a new test, iLearn, and we didn't give anybody really any chance to kind of prepare for it. And as predicted, the results were not very good. And so there's like a 2-year period where you can't use those to rate schools and do the things that I thought were questionable, even when the testing is not new. But at any rate, the hold harmless and the $291 million spending bill signed into law, so those issues are done. Other interesting thing I thought you might be interested to hear about is the Speaker actually killed a couple bills. You know, occasionally, it happens maybe a few times a session, where there's a bill kind of moving along and the Speaker kind of just decides he doesn't like it, or for some reason doesn't want it to get debated on the floor, and he'll just make sure it doesn't get called down, or sometimes even take it off the calendar, which really he doesn't have the power to do, but he doesn't. So just a couple examples to show you how this kind of process can work and why it matters who has the majority in the legislature. So in the House, we had one of the Republicans' kind of key bills, 1005, which dealt with being able to get good faith estimates about what non-emergency care would cost. So we're trying to get rid of the surprise billing thing. And there's bipartisan support for addressing what's just becoming a bigger and bigger issue every day, is people getting charged outrageous stuff they didn't expect, and it's not covered by the insurance, or something's out of network, all that kind of stuff. So there's a number of bills on that. So as that bill was coming through, we said, okay, the transparency or the right to kind of see what's going on with your billing and get an estimate in advance is good, but we really want to attack the prescription drug problem more aggressively. And one of our members, Representative Hatfield, had noticed that I think Florida and a few other states with Republican majorities were passing bills to begin the process of setting up a way that you could basically purchase your drugs from Canada very cheaply. And in fact, he pointed out that President Trump had directed Health and Human Services Agency to kind of set up a system to make sure that they weren't kind of counterfeit drugs, that they're actually good and all of that. And so Representative Hatfield made his pitch for that, and it passed with bipartisan support. So that was a little unusual, so that was good. And then a couple days later, the Speaker announced that he was just killing that bill. And he actually kind of groused that he was frustrated that all you have to do is mention that President Trump likes something and half his caucus votes for it, whether it's good or not, which I thought was a interesting observation. But he kind of felt that somehow they got misled into thinking that was a President Trump idea or something. So anyway, the point is that 1005 bill is gone. Now, the provisions of that may appear somewhere else in a Senate bill or in a House bill over in the Senate, and those provisions may ultimately pass, but it avoided any further consideration of purchasing your drugs from Canada and getting them more cheaply. So that's one example. Another one which involved me, which I was kind of amused by actually, is so House Bill 1418 was a bill that dealt with eliminating the ability for teenagers to get married, basically, which had some code provisions that related directly to the provision that's still in the code that outlaws same-sex marriage. And so my thought was, people don't realize it, but when something's declared unconstitutional, it doesn't automatically like evaporate from the code. It just sits in there. And it can sit in there for decades sometimes. And so I thought, like, okay, that provision's obsolete. The Supreme Court ruled. Doesn't really even seem to be that much controversy about it anymore. I'll just go ahead and use this as an opportunity to clean up that part of the code and get that out of there. And when I filed the amendment, the Speaker came to me and he said that he was not going to call that bill down if I offered my amendment, because he didn't want to vote on it. So I went to my own caucus and I said, okay, here's the deal. They said they're going to kill this bill if I offer my amendment. What do you all think about this bill, how important it is? And it was interesting because several members in the caucus said, well, it kind of looks like a not very important bill about, you know, what age you can get married, but in fact, it kind of relates to human trafficking because they feel there are some instances where girls are actually being sold into marriage as a part of human trafficking, and by eliminating parental consent for 15-year-olds and things like that, they could shut that down. So they said, this actually, we think, is a pretty important bill. So I said, okay, if that's the case, I won't stand in the way of that. And so I told both the Speaker and the author of the bill that I would kind of back off and let the bill go by, but for whatever reason, they still didn't call it down for a vote. So I don't know what happened there, but it's interesting. And again, that provision will probably show up in a Senate bill or be put in a House bill over in the Senate. So that's just kind of a little insight into strategery, as President Bush would say, about the legislature, because the majority has the ability to kind of control the mechanics of the system to avoid votes they are uncomfortable with voting on, but at the same time, they'll have an opportunity later on to get the stuff maybe they had to kill on the front end put in the back. And so that's why this part of the session is interesting. You can begin to see each house, different authors kind of jockeying to resurrect things that they lost in the first half or to get new things in. And then you get into conference committee at the very end of the session, and more things can pop up or other things can die. So that's out there. Along the same lines, bills from the Senate to fix that I would like to fix. As you know, there is a bill that would require accommodations for pregnant women in the workplace. And over in the Senate, they stripped out the substantive provisions and said it should just be a study of how much it will cost business to do it. Now, that bill's been passed over the House, and the House, if it wanted to, could have a hearing and restore the bill to its introduced version, and that's what I was hoping would happen. But I heard the Speaker say that he's not going to do that in this session, that he thinks there needs to be this study, and that essentially the state chamber and the manufacturers, the employers have to get around a table and you have to come up with something that will satisfy them in order for it to move. So we're missing an opportunity there. Another bill that went by the wayside over in the Senate, which the Speaker does seem to be interested in trying to do something about, is the whole needle exchange program. So, you know, there's a statute that authorizes local units on their own initiative to do needle exchange programs to avoid transmission of diseases through sharing of needles. And that bill was defeated on the floor over in the Senate. And it has a sunset provision in current law, so if nothing is done, I think on July 1st of this year, there'll be no more legal authority to do a needle exchange program, and all those theoretically would have to stop. Now, the good news is, I've heard the speaker say that he wants to try to at least get that extended another year so we can come back and look at it in the session. And I did watch the debate in the Senate, and I thought it's really interesting because there's just so much misconceptions about what a needle exchange is supposed to do. It's not really designed to stop drug use, because if you're addicted, you're going to be using drugs. It does have the advantage that if people come in to get the needles, you have an opportunity to talk to them about options they might do. So you actually can get a little bit done in that. But it's really harm reduction, and it's about stopping the transmission of communicable diseases. And if you look at what's happened once those needle exchange programs were in place, it really stopped those epidemics in their tracks. I mean, Scott County down south of us, the HIV numbers were like rivaling, New York, Manhattan, big city places. And once that got into place, then things really stopped. So I'm hopeful that maybe the House will figure out how to save the Senate and get that extended for at least a little longer so we can come back and have a more kind of thorough discussion about it. Now, the one thing that did get brought up in the Senate debate that I think is true is people are very frustrated because a lot of places, even here in Bloomington, you're finding a lot of needles in the parks and sometimes thrown in people's lawns and stuff, and that obviously is not a good situation. And some people blame the needle exchange program for all those needles showing up in those places. But I think that we have to have a more careful discussion about that, because the interesting thing to me is, you might not know, but it's a felony to possess a syringe. So if you're an addict and you've got a needle and you think you're going to encounter law enforcement or anything, you're going to ditch that thing as fast as you can. And so I think that's very counterproductive to have that in the code, and it's used quite a bit. And ironically, in order for the needle exchange program to actually operate, the prosecutors have to agree to kind of look the other way and not enforce that provision of the law. So I think that I hope we get the extension. Next year in a long session, we can have a more thorough discussion about what happens in that entire area. And then I'll just finish up, because I know I've used up my time. The coal bill, House Bill 1414, narrowly passed the House. It's off to the Senate, and if you want to learn more about that, I am on the Indiana Lawmakers Show this week, along with Representative Soliday, discussing that bill and a member of the Indiana Coal Council, and I think that'll air on public TV this afternoon on Channel 30. So there's your commercial for public television. Become a member.
Great. Thank you all for your insights. Okay, now we're ready for questions from the audience. I'd ask you to go to the microphone. Please state your name and ask your 1-minute question. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Mary Ann Williams, a resident of Southwest Bloomington. I'm referring to the redistricting issue. 16 state representatives and 8 senators have signed the pledge to end gerrymandering. I know a couple of you have done that. This was originated by former Attorney General Eric Holder and former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. The pledge is to support and advance fair redistricting that is transparent, non-discriminatory, and politically impartial. I know that you commented on this subject at the last legislative update. Could you offer any insight on why the Indiana Assembly cannot achieve a reasonable debate on the subject of establishing fair redistricting? Over the last 10 years, there have been numerous attempts by both parties in both House and Senate on the subject. Many citizens have expressed support for this debate. What factors are preventing this from happening?
All right, thank you. You want to begin, Representative Ellington?
So I'll discuss a little bit of history. So if you can remember the maps that were drawn, I think in maybe 2001, was drawn by a Democrat-controlled legislature. Those map lines, if you can go back online, you'll see those maps. I generally bring them here so I can use those as examples of facts. Had very long districts that was obviously earmarked to go down and either cut or add or either a Democrat community or a Republican community. But what happened in that the next several election cycles, in order to win control of the House, to make those maps, that legislature passed a lot of spending bills that went to individual communities to try basically to influence, I think, the election outcome. But what happened that next budget cycle was that since that legislative body overspent the state's dollars and funds, we had school districts and libraries and units of government that had delayed payments from the state because they had went into the red. It was bad policy to do that. So that next election cycle, you saw the movement from the voter registry voting for different philosophies. And the Democrat-controlled legislature lost a lot of its House seats because of bad policies. And if that wasn't enough, when negotiations was not working for them, they walked out and went to Illinois and left their job. And so that next election cycle, because of that bad policy move, they lost more seats. So it's not necessarily a Republican map or a Democrat map, because they lost their seats because of bad policy under their own maps. So I think you've seen especially in southern Indiana, a switch from Democrat-controlled city and town mayor's positions to Republican side, not because of the maps, but really because of communities' choice for a different policy. Now, what I've suggested in the past with leaders here in this community, if it's really important for the district and you feel it's important for the nation, start on a small scale, because mayors, town councils, county councils have the ability to have a nonpartisan redistricting commission set up on a local level, and you know everything starts at a local level first and it grows. That's called local control. So they've got the ability to do that in city councils throughout Indiana, town councils and county councils, but for whatever reason they've not chosen that. Now, I will say, before I was there, the Republican majority in the House actually voted and passed on one of those bills, but when it went to the Senate, it just failed. So I think that issue is really about policy more than really the maps. Indiana's maps in the nation have never been challenged because they're based upon really good demographics and good population census. So thank you for the question.
Who else would like to take a crack at that? Senator Stoops?
Well, I'm not sure. I think Jeff's saying that the maps were gerrymandered in 2000 by the Democrats. So even if that's the case, then surely a nonpartisan, or at least a fair system to create the legislative districts is the right thing to do for either party. And I think some of the issues that Representative Ellington talked to were actually under Mitch Daniels and after the recession. But the reason that we don't have a nonpartisan or a bipartisan redistricting committee is because the Republican supermajority at this point does not want to give up the power. If you can create your own districts, you can maintain control of the legislature, and you can maintain the number of members of Congress that you have that are your party. That's the reality of it. They're not going to pass any redistricting reform to combat gerrymandering while they have power. If, on the other hand, there seemed to be a move towards Democratic majorities, then you would probably see some compromise on that issue. It needs to happen. There's no excuse for it not to happen. By whatever your argument is, it should be a fair process. And there's another bill moving through that even if it wasn't a fair process, even if you had a partisan redistricting, at least it's transparent. So you have to say, this is the information we use to create these districts. When you say, oh, well, Indiana is a very Republican state, well, I would say, I would agree, it's probably leans majority Republican, but we've elected Democratic governors. We've elected Democratic U.S. senators. We've elected Democratic superintendent of public instruction, for instance. So if anything, it's probably 45, 55 with a chunk of independents in the middle. So maybe it's 45, 45 with independents that are leaning Republican. But when you create those districts, it should be a fair representation. The district should be fair. And I make the point to the legislatures is why do you need to protect your district? Aren't you satisfied with your own popularity and you know that you're doing the right things to run a fair race against an opponent rather than have everything set up in your favor? That annoys me the most of all. It's if everybody, you know, this is a democracy. They should be fair races, and it shouldn't be a rigged system. Right now, it is very much a rigged system. And in Indiana's gerrymandering has been contested.
Either of you want to weigh in?
Well, I think Jeff had a little bit of revisionist history there. I know that the general argument that Republicans make about why they're not pursuing any kind of nonpartisan redistricting system, whether it's a commission or committee or just something, they essentially say that, get over it, Hoosiers like Republicans better. And they vote for Republicans more. And it's really because you Democrats are horrible. You know, you have bad policies and nobody likes you. And that's why you're not getting elected. So don't blame it on the maps. It's just you guys don't have good policies. Right? And you know, my Republican colleagues, they have a right to say our policies are horrible. We both have different philosophical approaches and often disagree. A lot of times we agree on stuff, but at any rate, if you go back and look at history, the Democrats did draw the maps in 1990-2000, and there is no doubt that they were drawn to try to favor the Democrats as best they could. But if you look at those years, with those maps that were drawn by the Democrats, I think the largest split that existed was after the 1992 election, which is a pretty good year for Democrats. There were 55 Democrats and 45 Republicans. And then the other thing is, if you look at that 20-year period, there are several times where in 1994, 2004, and 2010, when the Republicans gained control, despite the maps that had been drawn by the Democrats. So in other words, those maps were not immune to these national swings in support for the party. If you go back and look, 94, that was the Newt Gingrich revolution. 04 was not a good year for Democrats. And 2010 was the big Tea Party rebellion. And so you usually had about a 52-48, 51-49 split under these years when the Democrats had drawn the maps. And so no one party could do a whole lot there. The supermajority showed up not because we went to Illinois. My Republican friends really love to bring that. That must have been a searing event for the Republicans. They keep bringing it back over and over again, and the Democrats have all moved on. But at any rate, they argue that because we tried to stop some bad legislation, that basically that's why we lost. Well, the maps were redrawn in 2011 for that 2012 election. And that's where you suddenly went from, because I think that after the Tea Party year of 2010, I mean, I think we did drop down to about 45 seats. I can't remember the exact amount. And that was a pretty big drop going from 51 to 45. But the next election after the Republican maps were drawn, it went up, you know, into the 70s, I think. So why does this matter? It's only going to get worse because the technology, okay? The days of the guy with the cigar in the back room with his slide rule looking at precinct returns and kind of saying, okay, this neighborhood's Republican, this is Democrat, and kind of drawing the maps to come up with something that would benefit his or her party, those days have been replaced by computers that have 1,500 data points about each and every one of us and our buying patterns, our behaviors. These are things that marketers use every day of the week. People probably don't realize it, but whenever you go to any ad-supported website or streaming service or anything, faster than you can blink your eye, that service has identified who you are, what your characteristics are. They've asked which advertiser would like to market to you, and they've had a bidding process about who will pay the most to talk to you. That all happens less than the time it takes to blink your eye. Those same techniques, the same ability to understand about each individual voter is now being put into these computers and cranked through. So it's not just like, oh, a lot of people voted for the Republican candidates in this precinct, so we'll put that in the district and make it more Republican. They're analyzing each and every one, and that makes it much more effective. And so you'll notice these maps aren't wearing off. Even if there's a big swing in the national mood for one part or the other, it's not penetrating whatsoever on these legislative seats. And so that's why I think it's critical to come up with some kind of nonpartisan system. But it's just difficult because no matter who the party is that's in power, they will not want to give up that advantage. So the people are going to have to demand it in very clear terms, or it won't happen.
Do you want to add something, Representative Mayfield?
Just a couple of thoughts on the end, and I think this has come up before. Representative Pierce was the only one who was here the last time the maps were drawn. And it predates the others here at the table. But as I recall, talking about it, and I did sign on to the resolution that was a study committee, because, again, you can't really make a decision unless you get some deeper data. But what I learned was the maps, and everyone talks about, there's so many cases that were going to court. Indiana's was not challenged, not even challenged. It wasn't ruled on in court. It was not challenged. And we had computers where people could submit their own suggestions, and the suggestions that were submitted were remarkably similar to what the legislators had come up with. The other thing is, I go to, when I travel to other states and I try and visit the capitals, I pick up the literature. Every single state says they are the most gerrymandered state in the country. So I don't know where that falls, but everyone claims to be the worst. So it's just I'm not comfortable with the information that we have to make that nonpartisan appointment because it comes from a partisan source.
All right, next question. Thank you.
All right, good morning. Thanks for showing up. My name is Pamela Davidson, and I have a question about public education. The supermajority GOP has done its best to destroy public education. They took away the property tax supports, and now we're on a referendum system, so the poor counties are already disadvantaged. Then here comes Betsy DeVos, paying off legislators, and now we have private schools, which are failing on all accountability measures. We just got a message that we were built $86 million for online schools that don't perform. They segregate schools because of 99+ are religious. They allow discrimination. They allow no public input. So when is accountability for charter schools ever going to happen? And when will the state of Indiana stop getting built by this system that's destroying public education at the same time?
Representative Mayfield, looks like you're ready to
You got a
go.
lot wrapped in there, Pamela. First of all, the virtual schools that are under audit, most, if not all of them, the chartering organization was a public school system. It was Daleville Public Schools, who did not manage them well. When you look at the underlying thought of the money should follow the child in education, that is one of the core tenets of what Republican, as you say, and a lot of Democrats in Indiana and other states want to give those children a choice. And that is the basis. They can choose, and most of them do choose, traditional public schools. Charters are public schools. There is no discrimination. They just have a capacity level. They have to take any student until they reach their capacity. And at that point, they go to a lottery. They cannot pick and choose prior to that. Only the school scholarships or the choice vouchers can those schools decide whether they meet the need of the child. I'm not sure what else you had in that question. But I'll let someone else, I'm sure that they picked up other points.
All right, I've had bills for years of trying to get some transparency into especially charter schools and private schools and requires some types of accountability for the authorizers. So these are like a Ball State, for instance, who would have charter schools under them. Dalesville School. So this is what I've heard since, just if you're not familiar, there are a set of virtual charter schools that were found to be, have children that had died on their rolls, children that were living out of state on their rolls, children that were duplicated between the two schools. They bilked the state to the tune of $68 million. And we knew this was going on. All the bills that I had were really targeting towards these charter schools that were abusing the system. So not only that, we call them public schools. And you'll hear this all the time. Oh, charters are publics because there's a charter school board, appointed by the governor, by the way. And that charter school board is not doing its due diligence. The charter school authorizers were just let go, as long as they're vouched for, the schools under them. So the Republicans now, because it's basically been a Wild West, we hand out the public funds, and these charter schools are not public because they're called public because of the charter school board, but basically they are not-for-profits, but they've hired for-profit companies to operate them and do all their services. So in the case of these virtual charters, the for-profit companies were paid roughly 80% of all of the money that these charter schools got. So there's this whole little myriad maze of companies, all with the same principal members as part of them. So they were basically just sucking up the public funds, and they had like an 8% graduation rate. They were F schools for years. They were failing schools because their kids weren't performing at all. And the state looked the other way. And you wonder why they looked the other way. It was so obvious. Well, it's because they gave $106,000 to Republican candidates. $10,000, $13,000 to Holcomb, and this is just one of the companies. We haven't actually gone into all these other companies and what they contributed. $10,000 to the House Republicans, $10,000 to the Senate Republicans, and you know what? The bills that were looking for accountability from the charter schools and the private schools never got a hearing in committee. Surprise, surprise. $5,000 to the chair of the Education Committee on this side, $5,000 to the chair of the Education Committee on the other side. You wonder why these bills aren't getting heard? And it is very obnoxious, first, that the Republicans are blaming Dalesville Schools, which is this school that's got, I don't know, maybe 1,000 kids. That was ridiculous to let Dalesville School actually authorize this virtual charter school to begin with. But the fact that we have to argue over trying to get $75 or $100 million in additional pay to give our teachers a raise. Our teachers are the lowest paid teachers in the country, including Puerto Rico. It's outrageous. And we can't, last year they gave public schools, not even directed to teachers, they gave public schools a 2% bump in funding. That's inflation level. That's not a bump in funding. That's just maintaining. Meanwhile, charter schools got about an 8% increase in funding. Private schools, 99% of them are religious schools who get to pick and choose what kids they want, who get to fire a teacher because she's a lesbian, who get to teach creation instead of evolution. They're getting like hundreds of millions of dollars of our funds, but we can't get the Republican supermajority and the governor to give our teachers $75 million so that they can get just a little raise by the time you spread it out to all our teachers. Absolutely outrageous. The system is very much skewed, and when you look at how much campaign finance money goes to these politicians, and then the policies that are promoted to protect those campaign financiers, it's outrageous. It's very much a pay-for-play legislature. We get special interests all the time. They cut a check to the Republican caucuses or the governor, and then they get some bill passed to protect either their market share or give them some special benefit. So there's some commentary there. Did I answer your question?
And boy, did ya.
Thank you.
Any other comments, Representative Ellington or Pierce?
Yeah, let me just say, I mean, I think anybody who follows the legislature all knows that the Democrats and the Republicans have just a very different philosophical approach to education. I think Democrats mainly believe that the taxpayers' money should be going to the traditional public schools, and we want a system where we have everyone from all kinds of backgrounds and socioeconomic levels all together in the same classroom. We want to have parents of all different levels, both rich and poor, with an interest, a stake in what happens in those traditional public schools. And my concern is the more and more you divert money into the private schools or these charter schools, you end up with this kind of natural segregation along socioeconomic lines that develop. And you know, the end result is you're going to have the traditional public schools with all the hardest kids to educate, perhaps with the least interested parents. And that's really tough. And so that's why we think it's so destructive to have these policies, and we just kind of disagree with that approach. The other thing is, a lot of this, I think the thing that frustrates Democrats so much is a lot of this was so predictable, and for 3 or 4 years now, we've been trying to get some accountability or some safeguards, particularly on these virtuals in there, but my understanding of what was kind of happening there is Delville is this struggling school, rural school. It's not getting the funding it needs from the state. And they creatively figured out that if we become a charter authorizer, we get 3% of the amount of money that goes to the virtual charter school as an authorizer. So this was a self-defense measure on the part of Delville to figure out how to get more revenue in the door. And you're right, they probably could have done a better job of actually overseeing what happened there, but I was a little bit taken aback when I saw that the Speaker of the House basically started shifting the blame to the Department of Education. Oh, they should have been paying better attention. Well, you know what? We should have been legislating. We should have been putting something in place to make that happen. And we'd offered lots of amendments to kind of do that. Representative Delaney from Indianapolis had really been looking into this pretty thoroughly and offering a lot of things he thinks would help on that front. So that's kind of where we are at this point. And you know, the truth is the voters will get to decide about this in the upcoming election, whether they like these policies or not. And we'll just see how it comes out.
Representative Ellington, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, that's a long question, but I'll try to keep it short. So yeah, right. Delville Community Schools is a public school. Probably was faltering a little bit. Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry. So Delville Community Schools was in charge of the charter that authorized this, a public school. And let me add that Republican legislator, Representative Lucas, is the one who saw this coming and actually asked for the investigation, coming from a Republican. You know, no matter what area of law, whether it's from corporations trying to take advantage of the system or investing companies trying to take advantage of the investor, whatever category it is, when someone breaks the law, it's really hard to point the fingers at those that are control the system when you have really public theft. So I can assure you that the state, along with the investigators, are not treating this lightly, because those dollars belong to every citizen that paid into this system statewide. So I think they should be punished, and they will be punished to the fullest extent. Now, since I've been up here in the legislature, that movement of the state mandating has been moving towards local control. When teachers and administrators several sessions ago said that we have positions that are hard to fill because there's competitions from bigger school districts around us, whether it's in the mathematics or English, they were concerned that the pay scale that's set by the state from the low range to the high range, which is locally negotiated, didn't give them the opportunity to reach out and pay someone more because they had a hard position to fill. We passed a new state law that said that for those positions that you locally cannot fill, you can automatically take that to the high outlier range salary at the high level to fill that position. That was one good thing for local control. Several others we did. On the testing, we extended these bills we have here today that's going through the House and the Senate. Hold harmless, teacher evaluations, education deregulation, which put all this back at the local level. So at least while I've been up here, we've been making that shift and that change because of your input. And I hope I answered at least some of your questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next question.
Yes, I'm Reverend Bruce Irvin from First Christian Church in Bedford. I have a question related to Senate Bill 342 that Representative Pierce referenced in his opening remarks. As noted, this bill now has gone to a study committee in its current form, but meanwhile, babies are dying due to premature births brought on by pregnant moms being required to do unreasonable tasks in the workplace. So my question to each of you is this: will you support the passage of SB 342 in its original form? And if not, how does your failure to support it square with a pro-life philosophy?
I read the bill briefly when it was in the Senate, and when you're talking about the terminology that they were using, I think some of it is still too broad and too vague when it says reasonable accommodations, reasonable time off. Well, what's reasonable? Does it require a doctor's statement? So I think it's still a work in progress to get to the, to get to the underlying parts of the bill. The study committee, I think, will be very good. We will be bringing in more data from, they say other states have it, yes, but they don't have it the same way we have. It's not as broad as reasonable. So let's take a look and share that information with the entire legislature and see what it's going to take. So, but our other efforts at reducing infant mortality have produced the greatest reduction yet. I think it was down 6% in a year. So the other bills that we've passed over the last couple of years are producing results. When we get this in the form that we can get it in to pass, it will produce additional results.
Thank you. Who else would like to field that?
I very much supported this bill as it came out of committee. On the Senate floor, it was amended to be a summer study committee. And that's when I think we had enough information, we had enough support to pass the bill as it was. And it basically just says, and first you need to know, Indiana has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the country. I hate to keep saying this stuff. We have one of the highest infant mortality rates in the country. And this bill was very simply a matter of just give pregnant women in your workplace a break, all right? You don't have to force them to stand up on an assembly line for 8 hours or whatever. You can give them a chair. You can give them a room where they can express milk after they've delivered. You can, again, just very minor considerations. You can't work a pregnant woman like you can some 22-year-old guy, and we've seen the results of an industry that has no requirement to put some considerations in for pregnant women. So that's one of the reasons we have one of the highest maternal and infant mortality rates in the country. So this was a very targeted bill to address one aspect of the situation. And I mean, I still hope that we see some version of this moving forward. But I agree, we're going to spend so much time and effort trying to make sure that women cannot choose to, for instance, have an abortion. And many times it's because of situations like this. I can't have a baby. My work has no consideration for women. I'm not going to get time off. I don't have any health benefits. I don't it makes it a difficult situation. So let's improve all that. Maybe more women will decide to carry their pregnancies to term. But exactly that, if that's your goal, then I think, especially if you have a pro-life legislature, hiring or passing this bill would have been a priority, in my opinion.
Representative Ellington?
I would say that I agree with Peggy Mayfield, Representative Mayfield, that, the infant mortality in Indiana the last several sessions, years, have been decreasing because of good changes in policy. I will look at that bill when it comes across to me and see what the makeup is then. I think it's a good opportunity to try to help make changes and protect those with children or those being in stages of pregnancy. But that leads to another issue also is, local communities, whether you're a city or county employee or whether you work at one of the factories and you've negotiated for health care, which really is part of your wages, and you've really maybe taken less in wages but more in health care benefits through your health plan. I think it's really important to keep that opportunity open on a national level to be able to choose your health care policy and not have it mandated, maybe policies who don't include the benefits you've worked so hard for as maybe a city or county employee or maybe as a union worker or representative. So I think that's one area that really we can pay attention to and try to help premature babies and stuff and health care for those prenatal additions. Thank you.
Representative Pierce?
Yeah, I think the important thing about that bill is the fact that it just got stripped down to a study committee. I mean, bills come through like that all the time, and you have discussions about, is it too vague? Is it too prescriptive? Is there a way to adjust it? And normally you would have amendments along the way and debates about that. Now, for lawyers, the word reasonable is not that scary because lawyers are there's a system for the courts and other people to kind of define what reasonable means over time, and it's actually meant to give flexibility to recognize that you can't anticipate every single situation. So there's essentially you kind of have this reasonable person standard. So in the legal world, that's not considered quite as vague as it might seem to someone who's not involved in the legal world. So I guess what was frustrating is it just got stripped down to the study committee, and the study committee wasn't even a balanced request. It didn't say, let's study how the needs of pregnant women compare to the potential costs that might be borne by the employer. Look at it holistically, it just said, let's study how much this will cost the employers. So you can tell the person who offered the amendment really was just kind of saying, like, we don't want to do this, it's going to cost employers money. And so that's the frustrating thing. Now, this comes back to my previous point about who has the majority matters, because that bill's going to come over, or has come over, and there's a couple ways it could be handled. I'm pretty sure from listening to the speaker that probably what's happening is it's been sent off to a committee and it's never going to be seen from again. And then probably there will be a study committee established to look at that issue because there's so much public attention on it. But if the speaker wanted to, he could assign it to a committee with a chair who will hear the bill. And the committee could debate whether it should remain a study or whether it should be returned to something closer to the introduced version of the bill. And they could move that bill, and it could come to the floor. And if it's still a study committee on second reading amendment, people like me could offer the amendment to return it to something similar to the introduced version. The entire 100 members of the House could debate it, and you know what? We could have a recorded vote, and we would see exactly how each legislator stands on that bill, and the voters could consider that when they decide who they want to send to Indianapolis to represent them. But because the majority has the ability to avoid those hard votes by having control of the process, and that's whoever has the majority has that ability. And so that's why you're never, I don't think, we'll see that bill on the House floor unless there's just some kind of really ferocious public demand for it that's perceived by the legislature. So there will be some kind of study this session. I suspect they'll come up with something for the long session they can pass that will address the issue. But, the point is we could be having some votes now and doing something about it now, but we won't.
All right, thank you. Next question, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Paula Staley. I'm a registered nurse. In House Bill 1004, I read that it was okay to bill out-of-network costs if the patient was notified before the services were provided. All consents I've ever read include some sort of a blanket financial responsibility that you must sign before the service is provided. Or if you're unconscious, when you regain consciousness, you have to sign that. How does that exemption in this House bill not negate the intent of the bill?
Who'd like to go first on this? Representative Mayfield.
The primary goal of that bill really affects two fields the most, is radiologists and anesthesiologists. And you generally don't pick those people anyway. You go to the lab, you have an x-ray taken, and that's all you know. You see the tech, or you know the surgeon. You don't know who's controlling the anesthesia. So sometimes, because of the way they work in the field, you don't even know who the anesthesiologist will be on the day of your surgery. It's whoever's on call or whoever they have. Anesthesiologists, I guess, are routinely not in every network. So you wouldn't even know to say, make sure the guy that's doing my anesthesia is in my network, because you might not even have that choice. That's what we're trying to protect. If I choose a particular surgeon, or I said, I hear that this is the best medical team to do this procedure, I know it's not covered, I'm going to be responsible for it anyway. That's what that is for. You can choose to go out of network, but you will be responsible for the out of network billing.
That's not the way the consents read, however.
And I can't get into that. Maybe they'll have to change those forms to comply. I'm not sure, but that is the intent of the bill. You can't be surprised, but you can opt for it.
I think that exception just negates the intent of the bill.
Does anyone else want to talk to this?
Sorry, man. And just, can I ask for, do you know if in the Senate bill, that language is also in the Senate bill? I know the Senate bill, which was similar, didn't go as far as it needed to or could have, but I'm wondering if that's a phrase we need to pay more attention to.
I'll have to look at that. I did not read that.
Yeah, sorry, Matt.
Yeah, I was just going to make the point that it's good you brought that up, and because that bill does have to go through the Senate process. So if there's a conflict in there or something is really not getting done the way it needs to be, that can be corrected in the Senate or maybe even in a conference committee. So at least now you've given a heads up to Senator Stoops, and he can kind of ring the alarm for other people on that committee to take a look at that language and make sure that it's actually in sync.
Did you have anything to add, Representative Ellington?
I'll say after this workshop here we get done, I'll come to you and we'll try to work out, and I can reach out to some senators across to the aisle over there to see if we can look into that issue for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, please. And I think this might be the last one.
My name is Bob Shanks. I live in Bloomington, a retired educator from Illinois. So I don't proclaim knowing about Indiana schools and education here. But I did appreciate the comments about the lack of transparency and so on in regard to charter schools. I think that is a real issue in this state, to be honest with you. But here's my question. I love discussion about local control. Big believer in local control. The question is this: how can you have effective local control when you do not have adequate state support for local schools?
All right. Representative Pierce.
I'll jump in real quick. I think you're absolutely right on that, because one of the first things that came up when the teachers started saying, like, hey, our pay's just not keeping up, we got a real problem here and we can't even fill these positions now. The first response was, gee, that's not our fault. The local school board set the teacher pay, so you should be down there complaining to them. And so then someone pointed out, yeah, but wait a second, you took the property tax away as the bulk funding mechanism for the operation of schools and you replaced it with state sales tax. And so now, if the state legislature doesn't provide an adequate appropriation and a school funding formula that's fair to each district, they're going to come up short and they're going to have no money to provide any pay raises. And so when that was kind of, oh, well, they're spending too much on non-instructional things. And you have that whole debate. It's basically like, well, they're squandering the money. And then it's like, well, what's a non-instructional thing? Is the cafeteria worker non-instructional who feeds the kid? Is the bus driver non-instructional who gets the kid to school? Is the janitor who keeps the school clean non-instructional? Are they just superfluous to the whole system? We get rid of them, take their salaries and put it into the teachers? I mean, it doesn't really work. And so that's been one of my frustrations, is there's just a lot of blame shifting going on, because it does come down to resources in the end. And when Mitch Daniels was governor, he used the recession as his opportunity to reset the baseline of school funding overall. And he rolled it back about $300 million, and it's never been made up. Even though more money's been appropriated each year, it's not kept up with inflation, or barely has. And so all of those things put the local schools in a box, and their only hope is the local referendum. And we're just very lucky that in Bloomington, for MCCSC, the voters have been willing to voluntarily pay more in property taxes to give the school a shot at providing the kind of education we want our kids to have. There are a lot of other districts that have voters that either are not willing to do it or just feel they can't afford to do it. And so that's a problem. So yeah, you're absolutely correct. You can talk a lot about local control, but if they don't have the resources to make decisions and the mechanism in which to raise the funds themselves, then you're stuck.
Who else would like to address this question?
This year, of course, we gave over $750 million over the previous years. Since I went into the legislature in 2013, we've increased school spending, K-12, almost $4 billion. Now, I am not going to say it's going certain areas, but they are categorized. So they know exactly what is an instructional cost and what is a non-instructional cost. It's all in their reports that they have to file. The $281 million that we voted down in amendments, there was no requirement that that go to teacher pay. Teacher pay was an option. It could have gone to the school's general fund. So we wanted to address that in the budget session. Also, the reduction in the turf when we paid down the retirement fund with the $150 million last year, that in itself gave Monroe County Schools $870,000 extra to spend, and that's aside from the increases that they got in the regular budget. The governor in his State of the State indicated he wanted to pay down the retirement fund another $250 million. So that's going to increase what can be used for teacher pay if the schools do it. Last time I checked, 299 out of 301 school systems had given their teachers a base pay raise, not a stipend, not a bonus, a base pay raise. It's only 2 school districts who had turned in their contracts did not do that. I don't know what the amounts are overall, but 99.9% of the schools gave their teachers a raise. So we continue, and we do, we continue to look at the funding formula. We continue to add the money. We want to make sure that when we add it to the base, that we'll be able to build on it year after year and not do the cuts when the recession came. When Mitch Daniels cut education, that was after he had cut local government 3 times before he got into education once. He did not want to touch that until he absolutely had to. But as we all remember, the bottom was absolutely falling out of the economy. So local governments even didn't get their disbursements from the state to pay their payroll and had to borrow money before education was cut, that $300 million.
I think we have to make clear that, as Representative Pierce said, Mitch Daniels cut $300 million from public schools. Then the following years, that was not replaced. So the school's already $300 million one year, $300 million the next. Was a huge burden to schools. Then over time, I first got into the Senate in 2012. We finally started advocating for increases in schools, And every year, every budget cycle, they would say, oh, this is the most money that we've ever provided to education in the state of Indiana. But when you look at it, it was below inflation rate. So it was not an increase, it was a decrease. And that carries through to this year. They'll say, okay, look how much money we gave to public education. Still a decrease, still not meeting the inflationary levels. All those raises that Representative Mayfield talked about were by and large below inflation levels. So the teacher did not get a raise. I mean, they got a raise in actual base pay, but they did not get a raise with how much their wage or their money, their salary could purchase. So they lost. When the state was told, well, this isn't, you're not giving money to teachers, you're just giving a small bump, not even inflation level, to schools, and now you're telling schools, so this is how the state did it, now they're telling schools, oh, you need to give your teachers a raise. And the schools are saying, well, we got all these, you're not giving us an increase. You're not giving us, we're basically at a level and we have all these needs that aren't being met. But meanwhile, you're telling us that we have to give our teachers a raise. So on the Democratic side, I think both the Senate and the House came up with different methods where we could actually direct funding to teachers to give them an actual raise, and it was turned down across the board. Paying off some of the pension funds was part of the proposal, so hopefully we'll see that move forward and that can actually be directed to teachers. But this idea that schools are getting this huge bump is not true. Anytime you hear that, be a skeptic. They're saying we're increasing funding for schools. How much? That's the question. And the answer is private schools got about 11% increase. Charter schools got, I think, 7 or 8% increase. Public schools got a 2% increase. So somebody's got to tell me why that's fair. Oh, I do have one thing to add. We had House Bill 1003. I don't know if anybody wants to comment about that, where it actually is giving flexibility to schools or to school or the State Board of Ed to grant waivers to school to allow them some flexibility in how they structure their curriculum, how they, some waivers to state mandates. So in general, that's good, but the problem is that's all directed at the State Board of Ed. State Board of Ed is completely appointed by the governor, and starting next year, the governor is also going to be appointing basically the Secretary of Public Education, or the Secretary of Education, which is now the Superintendent of Education. So they're going to have complete control of what schools they give waivers to, and I guarantee, just judging by past performance, those waivers are going to go to charter schools. Maybe they don't have to have teachers that are qualified, so they don't have to pay as much money for their teaching staff. And they're going to go to private schools. Right now we have freeway schools which have all kinds of waivers, and they continue to operate. State Board of Ed still gives them waivers. But one of the things we're discussing in the Senate is how do we take that flexibility, that ability to waive requirements, and give that to the local school board. So let's give that local control back to schools to have some control. Schools are different. Some are rural, some are urban, some are in ag areas, some are, there's all kinds of reasons you want to let the local school board make some of those decisions rather than the State Board of Ed.
Representative Ellington?
I want to thank the League of Women Voters for giving me this list of fact checks sites. I wish I had enough time to check these facts that have been talked about up here. They're really, really off base. The fact is that Indiana, at least while I've been up here, the increase to the educational budget statewide from state tax dollars takes in about 52% of our state budget. Those raises in the biennial budget that I've voted for has not only increased the education level above the cost of living, but it's also thrown and put in good investments hundreds of millions of dollars, just over 700 and some million this session alone, not counting the savings that we paid off debt early instead of continuing to have school corporations have bonds or loans for 20 years out that they have to pay the interest on. So that one tweak alone saves between 70 and 90 million a year that can now go towards teachers' salaries. I always get asked, why I cannot raise teachers' salaries. But the real issue is, that is a local decision at the school board level. Now, we get packets that talks about every school district that is in each of our districts. It gives us the contracts, the contract days. It even tells us the names of every teacher and the salaries they receive, and I review that. The discrepancy, and I think some of the problem is I don't know if it's a local policy change at your school board level, but there is some teachers that have several years of service, 20 plus, that really, compared to like a fireman or a police officer in that same community, is above them by probably 20%. I'm not saying that you're not worth 20%, but I'm just saying I use that scale, to kind of compare. And but what I've also noticed is the new teachers that are hired in with these school districts are much lower than what the older teachers came in from, when they began. So I think that is a problem. But being from Illinois, I know you understand the budget crisis that Illinois is in. Your pensions over there are so far underwater, I don't know how they're going to come out and even survive their pension plans. Indiana, I'll quote you from the Chicago Tribune, says, "What does Indiana offer that Illinois doesn't? Lower taxes, more stable home values, balanced state budget, and funded pension systems," which, as a retired firefighter, that means a lot to me, and I'm sure hopefully it means a lot to teachers and other educators. So we're trying to do everything we can to put the pressure on school boards to put those dollars into the classroom, but they don't want us to control that, and I can see why. But we're trying to help them as much as we can. At least we've made those policy changes in the last 5 years since I've been there. So thank you for your question.
Thank you all for your comments. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And if you didn't get your questions answered, I'm sure some of our state legislators will stay after and you can come up and ask your questions. That concludes today's legislative update. I hope that you'll come back on March 21st for our final update of the session. You can follow the work of the Indiana General Assembly online. They have a great website, iga.in.gov. You can track the progress of bills. You can track the work of the legislature in general. And you can also, our local media will also have coverage of what's happening in the session, the remainder of the session. I'd like to thank Ralph Shaw for making all the arrangements for today, for this program, and also all of the league members that helped in setting this up today, as well as Thomas Curry, who is the Chamber's public policy specialist today, here working. Thanks also to the Bloomington Public Works Office for use of this room for today's program, and CATS for recording these legislative updates. Be sure to check out the CATS schedule for any rebroadcast and tell people that you know so they can also share the information. And finally, thanks to our area legislators for being here today to share the information about the session with us. And thank you all for attending. Please let's give our legislators a round of applause. Thank you.